Hey friends, welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, my name is Alex and today we're going to talk about request validation in Spring Boot. So for this example, I want to show you how you can validate requests coming into the web layer of your application. And of course, we could always validate within the controller directly, doing it programmatically, or we could hand it off to the service layer. But I want to use bean validation for that today, and I will show you how we can come up with our own constraints and validate them. So without further ado, let's code. All right, so let's quickly take a look at our build file, shall we? So as usual, I'm using Spring Boot version 2.7.3, and there are two dependencies that we're going to use. The first one is the Spring Boot starter web, because we will focus on the web layer. And what I'm going to show you for the validation framework, that applies across the stack. So we could validate on the database layer, in the service layer, but I really want to focus on the web layer for this tutorial today. So that's why I brought in the Spring Boot starter web, and we're also going to use the Spring Boot starter validation, which brings us all the capabilities that we need to define constraints and validate them. I also already prepared a controller, so let's take a look at that. We can find it here. So what I'm going to do in this example is we pretend that there's some sort of registration process. And there's a registration request that I've created here. It's a data class. So it has a name that is optional. Then it has a username, a password, a confirmation. So that should be the password confirmation, and a birth date. So this is the request that we're going to work with. And there are a few things that I want to validate. So the name is optional. That's really just here to show you how you can make something optional. The username, I want that to be an email address. So that's the first requirement. Then I want the password and the confirmation to always match, right? That's the idea. It should have at least 8 characters. And that of course then applies to both the password and the confirmation. And finally, the birth date. I want to make sure that our service only allows signups from users who are at least 18 years old. So these are the requirements, and we're going to see how to enforce them using the validation framework in this video. So let's take a look at the controller. It's a REST controller. We're using the post mapping to registrations, and I'm using the request body to just map the request to the registration request class. And if you are unfamiliar with REST APIs or using Spring MVC, I suggest my intro video to getting started with building your own API for that. So as I said, we are in the controller here, and when the request comes in, we could validate it manually. So we could now check if request username and request password are the same. And I really don't want to do this here. I don't want to do it programmatically. Instead, what we're going to do is so let me remove that. We add the @valid annotation, which actually kicks off the validation process for that request. So, but there's not much to validate at this point. So how do we actually provide constraints for the types that should be validated? So let's start with something simple. Let's actually see if everything works as expected. So let's do that first before we dive into the application and figure out that something isn't working, which would be bad. So let me just quickly launch the application. And there we go. Let's see. Looks all good. Let's go to a terminal, and using HTTP we can do a post 8080 registrations. So name, I just removed the name since that is optional, as I said. Username, I want that to be just Alex. Password, now let's use an example that's wrong so we can later see what it looks like once it's correct. So password is secret, confirmation is who, and birth date is 2020, 1st of January. So we can see the username is Alex, password and confirmation don't match the birth date. So that means we have a person that's not 18 years old apparently, and the username should be an email address, so that should work. So let's just submit that and see what happens. So we can see it's an HTTP 200, and that's exactly what we expected, right? The application says everything's fine. That's the default return status for this invocation here. Oh no, we just want to make sure that a validation actually succeeds. All right, so let me remove that. So something's right here. What is that? Oh yeah, that shouldn't be in here. So how can we enforce our first requirement? So let me just maybe reorganize that a little bit, because that makes it easier to apply the constraints that we're going to use. So we start with the first one, which is the email, right? So I can use email like this. So email is actually a constraint. That's one of the default constraints that we can just use out of the box, and it will validate that this is a proper email here, right? So I have to specify the field target because I want this to be applied to the field. So if we now go back to the application and just, oh, it's not working, there we go. If I just restart the application and then we go back to the terminal, if I now would just submit this, we can see that the same request that used to succeed just a minute before results in an HTTP 400, which is a bad request. And this is because validation kicked in and the username is not a proper email address, so it doesn't succeed. So we can change that, of course, by providing a valid email address here. So let's do that now, just to confirm that it still works. So now I'm using an email address, and we can see that this works. And this is just what we want, right? So this is how we can validate the email. And this is pretty easy because, as I said, this is really out of the box functionality. But now it's getting a little bit more complicated, because how do we actually validate the password and the confirmation, and also the birth date? All right, let's start with the password and the confirmation. So what I'm going to do first is I define the constraint, and that's an annotation. So let me just write it out, and then we see how we're going to use that. It's an annotation class. I want this to be called password match. So that's the idea. And constraints need to have like 3 properties. The first is a message, which is just made available in case the validation fails. And the good thing is we don't need to hard code the message here, but we can use a message template, and we're going to use like this one. So this is usually the, well, let's see, where we do this constraint. That's for password match and failed. So this is just a template that's going to be replaced, and I get to that in a second. There are 2 other properties that should be present for this annotation to be picked up as a constraint. So first one is groups. I just write it out. That's an array. Requires class, pretty much any, and it's an array. So the idea here is, and we're not really get to that, but the idea is that you can use an annotation in different contexts that can be specified by groups. So if you, for example, would persist an entity, there could be a phase where something is created, and the same is actually true for the web layer. There could be one phase where something is created, but there could also be a phase where something is updated, right? In our example, it could be a registration, and later on it could be someone updating their user profile. So we could just handle it differently depending on the stage that we're actually in. So this has to be there, and the same is true for the third one, which is called payload. And let me actually write this correctly. It's also an array k class, and that has to be of type payload. So the idea is here that we really can just specify some additional payload with the validation. So we're not going to use like these 2. So we're not using groups and the payload. We really just focus on the message, and that's almost everything it takes for this annotation to be considered as a constraint. Of course, there are a few more things that we have to do here. So I'm using must be documented. Constraint, let's do this first. So there's constraint, and then I'm providing a validator. I will do that in a second because that's not ready yet. Because this is the annotation, but then of course I have to also provide the validator that can actually validate this constraint. So let me just finish the other things that we need. So I want this to be annotation target field. This should apply to, no, actually not. I want this to apply to a class, and I get to why in a second. Retention equals annotations runtime. Just making sure I have everything in place. So the target is class. Why is it class? Because we have to validate the password and the confirmation. These are 2 properties, right? And I don't want to annotate both of them, but I need access to both of them to validate they are the same. So this means I'm lifting up this constraint to the whole class, which is why this is the annotation target. So that's the constraint. And what we need next is the validator, and I'm calling this password validator. validator, and that is a constraint validator. And now we pass in the annotation. That's a password match, and then the actual class that we validate. So that should really be it. Let's see. There's just one function in there which is valid, so I know that's not null. Whoops, there we go. And we need the context. So this is the password validator. Now I can also specify this here. I can say password validator class. So password validator is validating the password match constraint. So now we can check if a registration request is valid. And the way we do this is we just return value password equals value confirmation. And that's all we need to do. So we just removed the logic. So we didn't really remove it because we haven't written it in the first place in the controller. We could have done the same logic in here, right? But we now lifted it out to this validator, which is doing the whole work of just validating that the password and confirmation are the same. So that's the annotation here, like the constraint. That's the validators. So what we need to do is now specify it here. So now what we have actually told Spring in that case is please validate this registration request because we want a password match. That kicks off the password validator, which just accesses the password and the confirmation and makes sure that they are actually the same. And there's one other requirement that I mentioned, and let me also add this here because I said I want this to be at least 8 characters. And this is how we do this. So there's size, which is one of the other out-of-the-box validation, not validation, but constraints that we can use. So I can say the password should have at least 8 characters. And then there's also the password match, so these are combined. So now let me see if that all looks correct. Come on, why does it not? There we go. Let me restart the application. And so it has started correctly. And now let's go to the terminal. Now, let's again try to register. I'm still using username as a correct email, but password and confirmation are not the same and they don't have the proper lengths. So let's do this, and we see it's a bad request. So let's see if we can fix some of the issues here. I'm using, now let's first do secret. So the passwords are now the same, but it's still bad request because they should be longer, right? So we do 1, 2, 3. And 1, 2, 3. And that's okay, that has worked because the passwords are the same, like password and confirmation are the same, and the password has the correct length. So at this point you may be wondering, how do we know, right? Because all the API is returning is a bad request. How do we know what the actual issue is? And we get to that in a second, so stay tuned. We're gonna resolve all of that. So, but let's finish this up by adding another constraint in the validator, because I said the birth date should be in the past so that the person signing up is at least 18 years old. So we're gonna do something similar like we've done just here. The difference now being that we apply directly to a field and not to the whole class. Because we of course could have just a one single purpose validator here, which just validates registration requests, and we can do all the logic in here, but we do it more on a finer grained level, so to say. So let's do the next annotation class, which I want to call just age, because we want to validate ages. And now I'm copying this over. We call this age fail, so in case the validation fails. I need pretty much the same annotations on the constraint annotation, except that we're gonna use a different validator. So let's see how that looks like, because we want to initialize that one, and it's the difference. So I forgot one of the properties because I want to make it configurable, right? All right, before we can actually apply this constraint, I need to remove class here and use field, because right now we want to apply it to a field and not the entire class. So let's go back to the birth date, and this is what this should look like. I want to make this configurable because I want to say, okay, birth date, like age at least 18 years old. So now I can use this as a parameter. And we have seen the validator here. So how are we actually able to access that value in the annotation itself? So that's the difference here. So we have the annotation, and now we start with the validator. We call it age validator, and that's also a constraint validator. And this time we use age and the local date. So age is the annotation that we have, the constraint, and the local date is just the birth date from our request here, right? So now let's implement the same validation function. Now we have to validate the date, but we want to validate the date against the parameter that has been applied here, right? We have the date, but we need this value, which is the minimum age. So how can we access that? Because it's not in here, right? There's no way to access it. So there's another function that we can override, which is called initialize, and that gives us the annotation. That should be not null anyway. So now we have it, and now we need to store it so we can use it later on. So how do we do this? So let's do private var min. That's a long. Now you see what this is going to. Yeah, I'm gonna check. So min equals null, and when we do just this, min equals age min. Right? So this is what we're doing here, just making sure it's properly initialized. And now we can validate as we've done before, and we just return value. So that's the actual birth date, right? It's the local date we got, so that's the birth date. We say the value plus years min. I'm just enforcing this here because that should be not null. Let's go there in a second. So value plus the years, 18 in that case, should be before local date now, right? So we use the birth date, we add 18 years, and we check if that's in the past, because then we know, okay, that's at least 18 years old. That's the validator so far, and we just have to replace this here. Validator. That should everything we need to do here. So that's, yeah, just to recap, again, a constraint annotation with the minimum, same parameters as before, and then we have the validator. It's initialized with the parameter from the annotation with the actual age, which is 18, and then we just validate as we've done before, passing in the actual birth date. So that should be straightforward. So let's actually stop and rerun the application, and then let's test that. So it's not let's code, it's let's test. So let's use the same request that we had before. Username, password should now be correct. So that used to work before, right? Because we fixed the username is the email, password and confirmation have been fixed. So now the birth date is still wrong, right? Because that's not 18 years. So let's send it off. Okay, and we see, okay, bad request. Now, let's actually fix this and make it something like 9080. So that should very well be 18 years. We submit it and we see HTTP 200, which means the request has been properly validated and it has been accepted. So that's all nice and well, right? But now actually, how do we know if we fail to provide a proper proper data? How do we get feedback from the API? And let's tackle that actually next, because I want to show you something that I've also prepared but didn't show you up until now. There's one file which is called validation. I'll just make this a little bit larger. Validation messages.properties, and in here you can find the templates that I've used in the annotations. So this is the one for the password match, the other one is for the age, and I would just want this message to be the passwords do not match in case our password validator fails, and in case the person is too young, we just return you are too young. So these are the messages, and we can now, of course, customize them to the language the app is being used on various parameters. But yeah, how do we actually return them? So, and the way that I like to do this is having some sort of custom API response. So let's quickly build that. First of all, let's create a class for that. It's call it API error. And what I want this to be like is having the fields. So there are individual fields like the birth date, for example, and there are global fields that apply to the whole request, right? So I want this to be a mapping from string the field and the actual message. So there may be a message or not, so that's why I make it nullable. We'll get to that in a second. And I want to have global messages that may apply to the entire request. So that's also nullable. API error. So how do we get from the validation error to the API error? So first of all, whenever a validation fails, there is some instance of bind exception. So what we can do here is let me call this on error. We just want to return the API error, and what we are listening for is the bind exception, or an instance of bind exception, because this is what the validation framework will throw if there is an exception. So on error, we return the API error, and the way we do this is the bind exception has some parameters, right? So first of all, let's get the field. So we can query the cause, like the bind exception, and then you can see field errors, and we're using them. And now I'm using associate from Kotlin just to make sure that I associate these errors from the field that they apply to the message that is relevant for that field. So this is what it looks like. So I'm using it field, and I map it to it default message, like this. And I'm doing something similar for the global errors. So I'm using cause global errors, and I just need to map them because they only contain the messages, default message. And now I want to do return API error fields global, right? We prepared everything for that. So yeah, so but how do we actually get the exception in here? We're using the exception handler annotation. So, and that should listen for the bind exception, just making sure that we get it in here. And so this will make sure that Spring is actually listening for that exception and then passing it into that function. And what I wanted to do is that the API error, when we return it, we shouldn't, I don't want to return HTTP 200, but I still want to return a bad request status code, which is using response status, HTTP status bad request. So this makes sure we're listening for the exception, we just read it, wrap it in a new object, return it, and we see the bad request. So that should be it. Let's see if we can just quickly run the application again with the new exception handler in place. That looks all good. So let's go to the terminal. So this is the valid request. Let's just submit it again. So we see that it's an HTTP 200, so that works nicely. And now let's change some of the parameters, just messing with our API. So first of all, let's make sure that this is not an email. Let's do this. So now, since I'm having the German local, you see the German error message which says it has to be a correctly formatted email address, and I can override that. But nevertheless, you can see fields, field username. This is just the name of the field that I have provided somewhere down here, right? Username. So it says the username, that's the error, but we don't have any global errors. So let's try something else. Let's make sure the email address is correct, but now we're using a different birth date. So what we get now is field birth date, you are too young, right? So let's just add a few more errors. I just want this secret. So the secrets shouldn't match, right? Now we see, or not the secrets, but the passwords. But now we see field's birth date has that specific error, you are too young, that's still in there. And now there's a global error because it doesn't apply to just one field, but actually both of them. So it says the passwords do not match, right? So we can see that all the errors are here. It's returning the HTTP 400 for bad request. And then we can just get all the information that we need from that error. All right, that wraps it up. This is how you can validate incoming requests in the web layer specifically. Again, there's more to be said, especially for the service layer and further down the line on the data layer. And I'm happy to chat about those in a different video. I hope this was useful. If you got any questions, let me just know in the comments down below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.